Welcome to this seminar on Taiwan. I'm Andreas Bøje Forsby. I'm a researcher here at the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies. The title of the seminar is Will China Forcefully Reunify Taiwan? Wishful thinking in Beijing, Taipei and Washington could spell conflict in 2019. And while this may seem like an overly dramatic title, I think that the current trends suggest that Taiwan could easily become a major flashpoint in the near future. By current trends, I of course refer to the strategic rivalry between the United States and China, which seems to be deepening on a daily basis. What we are witnessing, from my perspective at least, is a seemingly ever-expanding trade war that may ultimately lead to the decoupling of the two largest economies in the world. A geostrategic contest revolving around China's Belt and Road Initiative that US officials openly warns its partners and allies from joining. A technological competition centered on the Made in China 2025 plan, with the most prominent example being the hardening US campaign against Chinese tech giant Huawei. And finally, a geopolitical struggle for strategic dominance in the Asia-Pacific, or one should perhaps say the Indo-Pacific, to acknowledge the widening arena of the Chinese-US strategic rivalry. And if you missed out on some of the news from the geopolitical arena this week, let me mention that on Monday we saw yet another US freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea, this time targeting the Scarborough Shoal, which is effectively controlled by China, but also claimed by the Philippines, a US treaty ally. This was the second freedom of navigation operation in May alone, and the fifth this year by my count. A steep increase in these operations amid heightening US-Chinese strategic rivalry. And this morning, Reuters reported that the US Navy yesterday sent 2 vessels through the Taiwan Strait, further cementing, I would say, a new pattern of more frequent and regular transits by US Navy vessels through this very sensitive strait. So to help us understand the nature of this issue, which I should add is probably, Taiwan issue is probably the most important, enduring, and probably also the most intractable issue that divides the US and China currently. So to help us understand this issue, we are very pleased to welcome Peter Hayes Gries. Mr. Gries is the Li Kai-hung Chair and Director of the China Institute at the University of Manchester, where he is also a professor of Chinese politics. He studies the political psychology of international affairs with a focus on China and the United States. And on a personal note, I might add that I was very much inspired by Peter's work in my own PhD dissertation, his use of political psychology and especially his use of social identity theory to explain the role played by China's identity in its external relations. And so I think I should perhaps also add that this will not be a theoretical session in any way. This will be empirical matters. But with these words, I'll just give the word to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind intro. And thank you, Casper, for organizing all this and your hospitality. It's been great. Thank you up there for the gorgeous weather. It's been amazing. Please keep the weather nice over the weekend because I'm staying and I'm enjoying Copenhagen. To clarify on the title, could spell conflict. I don't mean to suggest that conflict is likely. Really, my colleague and I just want to make an argument that in this period between now and the 2 presidential elections next year, there is what many mainland Chinese are talking about as a window of opportunity. And it's frankly simply this discourse of a window of opportunity prior to the elections in 2020 that make us feel like that there is a heightened risk of conflict. So the overall risk is low, but it's a little, probably about maybe something like from 5 to 10%, or however you want to, it's hard to put a number on it. But we think it's substantially higher than it was last year. for example. Remarkably, the developments that we're going to be sharing with you really accelerated in a major way at the very beginning of this year. So my PhD student Wang Tao and I had been studying this issue starting last fall, but then we're very much struck by a series of things that happened in January, and it's just kept building since then. So yeah, just very briefly, I have been in the UK for 2 years, spent the first year fundraising and then setting up a China Institute, which has now been in operation. We just had our first birthday a week or two ago, so it's been 1 year now. And our goal is to promote China studies at the university, but we also have a normative agenda to conduct research with impact, and we seek to promote mutual understanding and reduce conflict. As was mentioned, I'm a political psychologist. What does that mean? It means interested in the kind of psychological underpinnings of international affairs, and in particular questions like why do mainland Chinese feel and think about the world in the ways that they do? Sorry about the typo there. My first book, China's New Nationalism, was based on the emergence of Chinese nationalism in the late 1990s in mainland China. It was based on basically reading Chinese texts, so it was very much qualitative. My current project is actually related to this talk, and it's on how Taiwanese feel and think about cross-strait relations and China. Actually, we've just gathered some experimental data in Taiwan, and we're analyzing that now, but we're also doing qualitative research in Taiwan. So we're interested in Chinese and Taiwanese views of the world, but also Western views of the world, and in particular of China. So my most recent book with Stanford was actually on American public opinion and how ideology divides, how it unites and divides Americans in the ways that they view the world. I initially set out just to look at how Americans, the drivers of American attitudes towards China, but then I realized I sort of disagreed with the broader literature on how Americans view the world in general, and so I ended up writing a much longer book of which there's one chapter on China. So this work, what I'm going to present to you today is basically a PowerPoint and expanded form of a snapshot published in Foreign Affairs online in February, which was called Will China Seize Taiwan? I co-authored it with Wang Tao, who is a PhD student of mine currently at University of Manchester. And more recently, and I just mentioned this earlier, Shelley Rigger, who is probably the leading American analyst of Taiwan, she has just published a piece online at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which makes pretty much the same argument we did, but from a different angle. You'll see that while we talk about Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, she does the same thing, but her emphasis is on the Taiwan side of the story. So she examines the domestic Taiwan politics, which unfortunately is becoming more and more partisan. As I'm sure others know far better than I do, the Minjindang, the DPP, is now looking to potentially have a challenger to Tsai from the Taiwan Independence side. So it's very possible that in the presidential election in 2020, you could have a kind of Taiwan Independence candidate going up against, in the Kuomintang, it could be someone who is quite pro-reunification. So it could be an even more polarized kind of election in Taiwan, and that's what Shelley talks about. I'll talk about that briefly, but our piece really highlights more the mainland side of the story. So if you want to hear more about the Taiwan side, this is a very nice short blog post, very similar to ours, so I think they're kind of complementary. I think the story in both cases starts with this sort of confrontation between Xi Jinping and Tsai Ying-wen that occurred at the beginning of the year. Tsai Ing-wen had a speech, I think, at the very end of December, and then Xi Jinping responded to it on January 1st or 2nd, and he was quite blunt. Now, when I when we quote from mainland Chinese sources, we use 简体字. When we quote from Taiwanese sources, we use 繁体字. So there's no partisanship there. So we don't forsake the use of force. The fatherland must be and will be 必然统一. It will be reunified. And if you read the text more broadly from that speech that was published, the speech was on the 2nd. It's one of those things where you kind of can, if you read it carefully and you read between the lines, sort of 字里行间, you get this impression of a kind of common discursive practice of sort of setting yourself up in the moral high ground and then sort of pointing the blame at the other, Tsai Ying-wen, for, if things, if being nice doesn't work, we have other choices. So basically between the lines, what we read is this 先礼后兵. So, we're going to be diplomatic at first, we're going to be a gentleman, but if you don't respond, we're going to act. Now, we were reading this between the lines of this January 2nd speech on Taiwan. If you look at the very recent deterioration of relations between the US and China over the last week or two as the trade war has intensified, now you just have to read the headlines only of the People's Daily, and you'll see 先礼后兵. So mainland China is now, this discourse is becoming very mainstreamed, not just in the conversation on Taiwan, but also in the conversation on the US. And of course these two things are linked. Because for many Chinese hawks who advocate forceful reunification with Taiwan, one of their rhetorical arguments is things can't get any worse with the US, so might as well do it now. Scary kind of logic. So we just watched that little video, which was nicely produced, had a nice little tingle to it, jingle. But if you were following the Chinese, there was much to be disturbed about. You may have noticed very briefly this image. It's Taipei 101 in the background. This is the pin or badge of the PLA paratroopers. So that's not too subtle allusion to literally invading physically the island of Taiwan. And then at the very end, this isn't a sexy photo, but it's a pretty ominous statement. What this says is, this is produced by the political section of the PLA paratroopers. This is pretty alarming kinds of stuff, for this to be produced by them, openly stated that way, and then disseminated in Chinese social media. Because remember, anytime the government publicly makes statements, it rhetorically backs itself into a corner, right? So the Chinese people, nationalist public opinion, can hold the government accountable to its own claims. Now, many of you may be skeptical towards that claim because, China, it's communist, it's a dictatorship, they don't need to listen to public opinion. On 9 issues out of 10, I would agree with you, but not on nationalism. And I've made this argument from the beginning of my career in my very first book. Nationalism is different. Because the Chinese Communist Party has staked its claim to legitimate rule for 70 years now. In October, we have the 70th anniversary of 1949. What did Mao Zedong say when the PRC was established on the rostrum in Tiananmen? What does everyone remember him saying? Anyone know? 中国站起来了. China has stood up. No one remembers him for saying, 劳动人民团结, workers of the world unite. The Marxist sayings, no one remembers that. What people remember is the nationalist claim, which the communists have been making from day one. And now in the 50s and 60s, they used to make Marxist claims as well. But with the Cultural Revolution and the Tiananmen Square massacre, that's done. Nobody buys those claims anymore. So the CCP has to rely on its nationalist claims to legitimacy, which therefore gives the Chinese people the right to speak back on that issue, but not too many other issues. So I believe that discourse like this matters because essentially the CCP paints itself into a corner. Okay, so the agenda today, and how much time do we have? How much time did you allot?
We have around an hour.
Hour, including Q&A?
No, an hour and a half, including
Okay, good. So the first thing I'm going to do is discuss the evolution of discourse from peaceful to forceful reunification. And then I'm going to take a kind of tripartite look from the perspective of Beijing, Taipei, and Washington with the focus on the former. So China dreams in Beijing. And I hope our colleagues and friends from Taiwan will not take offense. But I am going to make a slightly provocative argument about the situation in Taiwan, which is one that has to do with the overwhelming nature of the China threat, leading to a certain kind of politics in Taiwan that both utilizes the China threat but also dismisses it. So this may be quite controversial. And then I will engage in some serious self-criticism because I think Donald Trump has a very large role to play in creating this tense situation that we're in this year. And I'll conclude by talking about why I think 2019 and the beginning of 2020 are a period of particular concern where we should be particularly careful. So that's going to be the argument. So the first point, from peaceful to forceful reunification. So this is just a little bit of historical background here. We are celebrating a lot of anniversaries this year, one of which is the 40th anniversary of 改革开放, reform and opening. And the idea of peaceful reunification has been part of that ever since. And of course, in 1997 and 1999, Hong Kong and Macau, from the mainland Chinese perspective, were peacefully reunified. And I would argue that starting about 10 years ago, the pressure really ramped up on this because the government, the Chinese government, the CCP, was highly successful in a propaganda campaign, in two propaganda campaigns. The first and probably, well, I don't want to assess them against one another, but the global financial crisis was sold to the Chinese people as an example of why the Beijing model, the Beijing consensus, was superior to the Washington consensus. And basically, they argued to the Chinese people that China's model has emerged superior, and the Chinese economy is a lot stronger than it used to be relative to Western countries. And I think that most Chinese bought that argument. And unfortunately, I don't think the Chinese government realized that there would be a cost to the success of this propaganda campaign, which is now Chinese nationalists are no longer willing to basically give the government a pass when it is soft on neighbors who Chinese people don't feel are deferential enough. In other words, prior to 2008, the government could say, well, you know, we need to 韬光养晦. We need to bide our time, as Deng Xiaoping told us. We can't get mad every time Japan does this, or US does this, or Vietnam does that. We need to focus on reform and economic development. We're not strong enough yet. We need to bide our time. But after 2008, the people would basically say, you've told us we're stronger now, so we're not taking any crap from you Vietnamese, or you Japanese, or you Americans. And so you've seen definitely a more assertive turn in Chinese foreign policy since 2008. I think there's a pretty broad consensus in the China watching and security fields that Chinese foreign policy has become more assertive in the last decade. And of course, the 2008 Beijing Olympics can be seen as equivalent to a debutante ball. Does that metaphor work for those of you outside of the US South? It's very much an American Southern idea. Maybe another metaphor which won't work is the quintera, like in Mexico, a young girl at 16 becomes a woman. That's what a debutante ball is. It's when you step out into the world and you show the world that you have arrived, and you demand acceptance. I would argue that's what happened in 2008 with the Beijing Olympics. You look at those Zhang Yimou opening ceremony, that was a performance that China was stepping out in the world and demanding recognition for 3 decades of reform and opening and what China had accomplished. So again, another turning point of expectations. But then what happens? Tsai Ying-wen is elected in 2016, and people, all of a sudden the noose tightens on Taiwan. 5 countries have since 2016 switched their recognition from Taipei to Beijing. And discourse has heated up. So just as an example, this is Cui Tiankai in the spring of 2018, so about a year ago. No one can stop China's reunification. We seek peaceful reunification, but if that doesn't work, we will achieve reunification another way. 别的方式. This is a diplomat, right? So for a diplomat, this is pretty direct for a diplomat, right? But we can get even more direct. I guess that's an example of things that people say. Well, were they backed with action? Beijing has forced Taiwan out of international organizations like the WHO, not even allowing Taiwanese participation under names that Taiwanese find insulting, like 中国台北, right? I think that was the case for WHO, although there have been many permutations. And as I mentioned, forcing other countries to break diplomatic ties with Taiwan. This is an example of the Dominican Republic. So this is a pretty insulting photo from a Taiwanese perspective to see, the Chinese foreign minister with the Dominican Republic's foreign minister. So here, I think, so you ask, so who cares? Does this matter? To me, my interpretation of these kinds of policies is that a lot of people in mainland China have given up on winning Taiwanese hearts and minds. Basically, for decades, there has been this idea that time is on China's side. As China gets bigger and stronger, as Taiwanese invest more in China, as more and more Taiwanese go to China and their lives become interdependent with China, peaceful reunification will just happen. But it didn't. And so I think that a lot of mainland Chinese are giving up on having essentially winning the Taiwanese public over. They're looking at the trends in Taiwanese public opinion, how Taiwanese self-identify, and they're seeing things go in a direction that makes them uncomfortable. Now, I think they're right. I mean, if you look at trends in Taiwanese public opinion, it is increasingly towards Taiwan independence, right? There's, I think, probably part of the problem that was that prior to a few years ago, the Chinese Communist Party was able to largely control the ways that the Chinese public understood the Taiwan situation. And what they did, especially under Chen Shui-bian, was to demonize Chen Shui-bian and a small group of deep green in the DPP. And basically convince the Chinese people that if it wasn't for Chen Shui-bian and the DPP, you would have reunification. Most Chinese, I think, believe that the vast majority of Taiwanese Tongbao compatriots actually desired reunification. But what's happened is that since the Sunflower Movement and I guess more open internet interaction between Taiwanese and mainland Chinese online, more and more mainland Chinese are understanding the actual situation, which is that the vast majority of Taiwanese do not desire reunification. And so that is creating a kind of shock and a kind of anger that is now saying, well, you don't want to be with us? Screw you. We're just going to pressure you. We're going to squeeze you. I'm running with the idea of an article called Squeezed States. I think that'd be fun if I could pull that off. China dreams in Beijing. What exactly is going on here? this famous line from Sanguo Yanyi, the empire long divided must unite. I think that's the broad kind of political culture context within which a lot of people, including Xi Jinping, are thinking about the Taiwan issue. Impatience for reunification is growing, while prospects for peaceful reunification appear increasingly dim. Again, a broad kind of consensus that economic carrots during the Ma administration did not work. And as kind of a symbol of this, the Sunflower Movement of 2014. And here's the key, is that we argue at three levels here, that there are groups of people at all three levels who increasingly find the idea of forceful reunification tempting. From Xi Jinping at the top, to political and military elites in the middle, to mass public opinion, popular opinion at the bottom, as seen through sites like Weibo, so online Chinese netizens, no longer convinced that the status quo favors them. In fact, they see the direction going against China, and it makes them feel a greater urgency. Okay, so let's start at the top. Wan Neng Zhu Xi, right? This is a common nickname for Xi. We've seen this trend. 2018 Constitution amended. We talked about Emperor for life. Just want to pause for a moment to point out how remarkable this is. Unfortunately, I've been in this business long enough that I too, certainly for many, many years, had this teleological narrative that, after the Cultural Revolution, China's leaders had experienced that chaos. Deng Xiaoping had set a precedent that we have to move away from the danger of a personality cult, that giving one person too much power was too dangerous. We need to move towards collective leadership. We are going to retire before we get too old. This was not just Deng. This occurred under Jiang. This occurred under Hu. You had a clear, linear movement away from centralization and towards collectivization of leadership. And this occurred for over 3 decades. So that's how dramatic this change is. Tell me one China watcher who predicted this change a decade ago. I'd love to see it, because we all thought this trend towards collectivization of leadership would continue, but it has not. Xi is different. And what scares me is the link that Xi and others draw between Taiwan reunification and his dream of becoming another great leader and the China dream more broadly. This is my colleague Shending Li, who's kind of a hardcore rail politique, kind of IR theorist at Fudan. It's a great quote. The only thing that will make Xi Jinping the greatest leader of Chinese Communist Party history is to take Taiwan back. If he were to achieve reunification, who can say he is second to Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping? And guess what? I think Xi Jinping agrees with that assessment. The Taiwan dream, the China dream, which is everywhere in China today. I mean, you can't walk down a street without seeing bulletin boards and things like this. Clearly associated with Xi Jinping, 中国梦, 人民的梦, the China dream, the people's dream, and the image is Xi Jinping. But here is the problem. Even as early as 2017, achieving China's full reunification is essential to realizing national rejuvenation. So Xi himself is linking these things. This is disturbing. Now I want to get to the second level. So we're going to give you some examples of political elites. Now you may notice that we end up quoting a lot of retired elites, retired generals, retired leaders of former deputy director of the PRC Taiwan Affairs Office. You're going to see a lot of formers. Why? Because when they're active, they have to keep their mouths shut. It's when they're retired that they start speaking frankly. And often that's narcissism. They want attention, right? They want to become a kind of public figure. They want to be interviewed. They want to get some noise out there. But I think it really is an opportunity for them to speak what they really feel without the constraints of being in a position of authority. Wang Zhaixi, deputy director of the Taiwan Affairs Office for many, many years after he retires, this logic is very powerful. The 2005 anti-secession law clearly states that there are 3 scenarios that will require forceful action against Taiwan. The third is that possibilities for peaceful reunification are exhausted. Today that possibility is disappearing. So this is actually even codified in law, that if peaceful reunification is possible, other means must be taken. Wang Hongguang, God bless him. Nowadays, Taiwan Independence is the mainstream opinion in Taiwan. They have become irreversibly pro-independence. Taiwan's youth increasingly see themselves as Taiwanese and not Chinese. In a generation, there will be no one left in Taiwan who considers themselves Chinese. I really think this is increasingly a widespread view, that time is no longer on China's side when it comes to the issue of reunification. And this is what's creating a sense of urgency in mainland China among hawks who desire reunification. From the Taiwan Affairs Office, and this is actually an active official, not a retired official, and this is in the 学习时报. Without the complete reunification of the fatherland, it will make no sense to talk about the great renaissance of the Chinese people, and the China dream that the Chinese people have been longing for will not come true. So this is just a more extensive and thorough discussion of what Xi Jinping himself had said earlier, and appearing in print, top of the fold, front page. So what's happening at the level of public opinion? Frankly, this is where most of our attention is. It's very hard to make broad generalizations. There are all kinds of opinions available online. All we're arguing is that there is a sizable group of hawks online, and they come in very alarming stripes. This is one summation of opinion made by a former director of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Zhou Zhihuai. His assessment is that mainland Chinese public opinion became impatient with Taiwan a long time ago. And I would say that that probably begins with the Sunflower Movement. That's when things really started to change. The popular cry for forceful reunification, 武力统一, has become high-pitched. So, is it just words? No, I think there are real deeds and actions that accompany this rhetoric of 武力统一, forceful reunification. So this is a military parade in 2017, and you can see Hu Jintao reviewing the troops, and what is that in the background? It's a replica of the Taiwanese presidential palace in Taipei that is used for mock invasion drills. Maybe mock isn't the right word. Actual invasion planning and training. And of course, this is far more consequential. The actual circumnavigation of Taiwan twice in 2017. Liaoning. So, what do the military experts say about this? They certainly understand the military situation better than I do. If we look at Taiwan's own military, they say that the PLA plans to complete its comprehensive preparation for using military force against Taiwan by 2020. What does the US DoD say? In its 2018 annual report, it says the PLA also is likely preparing for a contingency to unify Taiwan with China by force. And of course, this would pull in the US, simultaneously deterring, delaying, or denying any third-party intervention on Taiwan's behalf. So when the DoD writes that, they're obviously making an argument for further US military buildup. Okay, so now probably the most controversial part of the talk, and again I should defer to Shelley Rigger on this. She's really more of an expert. Her piece again is more on the electoral politics leading up to the presidential election next year in Taiwan. Our argument is more about the psychology that seems to be underpinning politics in Taiwan when it comes to China. And it comes from this observation that paradoxically, China seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in Taiwan at the same time. There are ways in which China is constantly being invoked by politicians, political parties, but there are other ways in which there is this deafening silence. Like, how does China figure into this? What we want to argue, maybe I shouldn't say argue, because this is still sort of a hypothesis that we're playing with. We don't really have evidence to support this yet. So the idea we're playing with is that China poses an overwhelming threat to Taiwan, but it seems like the vast majority of Taiwanese people believe there's little they can do about it. And as a result, well, let's kind of provide some support for that argument. A poll from about a year ago, 40% of the Taiwanese public had no confidence at all that their military could defend Taiwan. So that's a lot of people who really see the threat from mainland China as completely overwhelming. And yet, there also seems to be simultaneously a view that China can't possibly attack or won't attack. 65% said that the PRC would not use force against Taiwan. And 23% saw an attack as completely unlikely, while only 6% felt it was very likely. Now, remember, this is last spring. So things hadn't heightened as much as they had at the beginning of this year, but even, the screws have been on ever since Tsai Ying-wen was elected. There had been these competition over diplomatic recognition, the squeezing that was going on had been intensifying, and still, despite all, and you had the circumnavigation of Taiwan twice by the Chinese Navy and its aircraft carrier, and still people say PRC won't use force against Taiwan. So, are we alone in finding this unusual? I think the Control Yuan report makes sense. They say there's a lack of a sense of the potential danger from China. I think they're right. For example, the end of conscription in 2018 in the Taiwan military. It was made to accommodate politicians. And this has been the culmination of a trend over at least a decade where the two parties competed to curry favor with Taiwanese voters. And the way they did it was by giving more goodies. We're going to give you more less tuition money, or we're going to give you more help for school. We're going to reduce conscription. All of this despite the fact that the Chinese military is building up. The Taiwanese military recognizes what's going on in China, and yet the politicians end conscription. How can they do this? Things are so bad. They really are bad. I mean, serious shortages of officers that are affecting morale. This is not me saying. This is Taiwan's own assessment of its military situation. The entire military has 整个军队. They're not just talking about a few battalions. 整个军队 has no, the entire military has no morale. That's quite an indictment. And you may or may not find this fair, but when you juxtapose the desperation of the Taiwan military to what's going on across the strait with the PLA, it's pretty shocking. To try to compensate for the lack of conscription, the Taiwan military is trying to recruit volunteers with cartoons. You know, where basically using a female to try to entice men to enlist. It seems laughable. And in fact, there was a scandal, I guess it was 2 years ago, where this young officer went on Facebook and basically flirted with guys to say, come enlist. And this isn't out of the blue. Officers were actually being pressured to help with enlistment. Enlistment was such a dire problem that the military was asking its own officers to get involved in recruiting. So this is what this young woman did. She wrote this post. Will you accompany me? 你愿意吗? This was a huge scandal when this happened. So this is the kind of political psych idea that we're playing with, and again, we don't have strong evidence for it, but one of the core ideas in psychology is that we tend to see what we want to see. The world does not exist out there independent of our perception. At the very basic level, perception is reality, and often we see what we want to see. And sometimes you have a situation where a threat is so overwhelming, it can't be controlled, that our psychological response is just to ignore it. There's nothing we can do about it, and if we think about it, it's going to generate too much anxiety. We will be disabled, basically. And so the psychological response is just to shut it out. And so that's our question, is that what's going on here? Defensive avoidance. Interestingly, my colleague Chris Berry in London, who works on film, wrote a paper that was quite interesting about 3 very popular movies from a few years ago in Taiwan, and he called it Imagine There's No China. Because one of the things he found striking about these movies is that they were extremely popular, and he thought, why are they so popular and they have this deafening silence of China? And he was sort of arguing that maybe they provided for the Taiwanese people 2 hours of pure escape. We can escape this world where China is sort of always there. And these movies instead go to the past or go to Japan, and they focus on a world where China is absent. So this suggests something similar may be going on. And what I want to argue here is that you see this kind of deafening silence or defensive avoidance on all sides in Taiwanese politics. So this is an example of a DPP academic named Fang Shiping, and he basically says, oh, you know, China won't attack because they have too many domestic problems, because of the one-child policy, you know, 他们的青年都惯坏了, they're all spoiled kids, they won't fight, they won't sacrifice their life for forceful reunification of Taiwan. Of course, you know, this is the logic that has led to a lot of wars over the history of mankind. You know, we have will, they don't. We'll be home by Christmas. They don't have the will to fight. You know, this is why wars start, is we underestimate the resolve of our opponents. And, you know, the problem, Tsai herself, at least back in 2017, the problems between the 2 sides of the Taiwan Strait will not be solved by military force, but in a peaceful way. The mainland Chinese leader today is a rational decision maker. Really? You don't think he has his own ambitions, and that he might act based on emotion and identity? She may be right, she may not be. Now, if you look more closely at some of the things she's been saying more recently, it seems she's starting to pay attention to this escalation on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. But if you look at politics now, the DPP has proposed a bill that would require a referendum prior to and after any negotiations in Beijing. Why have they done this? Because they're concerned about losing the next presidential election. And they want to bind the hands of a future, say, Kuomintang presidential candidate and prevent them from just easily going to China and signing some deal. So I understand the kind of domestic logic behind this. But what about China? How would China react to this? Chinese would react to this by saying, hope for peaceful reunification is over. This will just embolden mainland Chinese hawks who advocate for forceful reunification. So why would DPP legislators be so reckless? And possibly it's motivated reasoning. Yeah?
Negotiation you're referring to, is that specifically about negotiation about reunification?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Yeah. I think so. I don't know the exact language of the legislation, but I'm pretty sure it's specifically about negotiation with Beijing over the terms of reunification. And DPP legislators are very concerned about what might happen under the next presidential administration if it's not DPP. And on the other side, there's a different kind of sort of logic that says we have nothing to worry about. You know, Ma Ying-jeou said, 没有这个问题. You know, there is no problem when it comes to forceful reunification. And again, it's this kind of ignoring what's going on in Beijing and focusing myopically on domestic politics. The Kuomintang habit is just to point the finger at the DPP. As long as there's no DPP, there won't be a problem. The problem is only when the DPP is in power. And Ma Ying-jeou is not the only one to say this. You know, others do too. There's an outspoken professor who is a Kuomintang supporter. Taiwan doesn't face PLA threats when it's conciliatory under Kuomintang, and it benefits. Instead, it's only when it's the DPP. But, you know, this is 2018. This was, shoot, I don't have a date on that. Yeah, 2018 also. Well, Chinese attitudes have changed, you know, since the Sunflower Movement. So to me, this is almost like a purposeful ignoring of the reality of what's going on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese people now see Kuomintang as almost as bad as, at least these nationalists, almost as bad as the DPP. Because they say nothing changed under the Ma Ying-jeou administration. And in fact, the Sunflower Movement shows that economic carrots won't work. Ma Ying-jeou was just playing for time. And he took the carrots from us, and we didn't get anything in return. Okay, so now let's turn to Washington. I think there's a lot of blame in Washington as well, because Washington has, I hope this doesn't come across as egocentric as an American, but I do think the US has played a key role in maintaining the stability in the Taiwan Strait for decades, and the way it's done that is through a policy of dual deterrence, which the proof of its success is that neither side is happy. So dual deterrence depends on American diplomats being reviled and disliked and yelled at by Taiwanese and Chinese diplomats. And I've personally seen this. I have run the US-China diplomatic dialogue for 11 years. Every time Taiwan comes up, the American diplomats sitting around a table just like this have to listen to their Chinese diplomats yelling at them. And Taiwanese diplomats often get very angry at American diplomats as well. And basically, dual deterrence is a combination of carrots and sticks to reassure and deter both Beijing and Taiwan. Beijing is warned not to attack Taiwan unprovoked, but reassured that Washington would not support formal Taiwan independence, and Taipei is reassured that Washington would come to its defense as long as it did not provoke Beijing by declaring de jure independence. So basically what dual deterrence does is it satisfies each side that they won't have their worst case scenario, but it frustrates them and it denies them what they really want. And that's why China policy has been Taiwan cross-strait relations policy has tended to be volatile between administrations, because every new administration needs to learn how to do this. And there's often a learning curve. Most presidents learn fairly quickly. Not our current president. In fact, he still hasn't learned this. And in fact, I would argue that Trump is simply too narcissistic to understand and learn. Probably, it may actually be too intellectually complex for him to understand dual deterrence. But the bottom line is, on every issue, not just Taiwan, Trump, he has a narcissistic grandiosity that needs affirmation. So he says what he thinks his audience wants to hear. And that's why his policies move around a lot. If he's talking to this group, he says what they want to hear. If he's talking to that group, he says what that group wants to hear. Doesn't matter if it's domestic politics, foreign policy. And we've seen that on the Taiwan issue, and it's made things more volatile. He needs praise. Our policy has waved dangerously back and forth, depending on which side gets to Trump's narcissism. And this has destabilized the Taiwan Strait. So a lot of people in Taiwan were very happy when Tsai Ying-wen got to Trump first, right? She called him and congratulated him on his victory, and of course he was thrilled. Someone was praising him. This is what he feeds on. He's a narcissist. But, this boomeranged against Taiwan. Because, of course, when Taiwan is too happy, China's pissed off. And China has a lot more resources to leverage than Taiwan does. So what happened? Just a couple months later, Trump basically turned around, and in order to get praise from Xi Jinping, he virtually came out and said, we support the one China policy, which is even worse than where you started from, right? So you get this crazy swing back and forth, destabilizing the situation. But of course, the Chinese overdid it too. And now it's swung back, you could argue, to the Taiwanese side. You had the Taiwanese Travel Act in 2018 and the trade war that Trump initiated. Now, the Travel Act you can't put on Trump. That was the US Congress, and it was pretty much a unanimous thing. But, yeah, the picture's pretty good. The panda's pissed, right? And, while sort of short-term thinking may be, okay, that's good for Taiwan, overall, in terms of stability in the Taiwan Straits, it's not good. And dual deterrence doesn't really exist right now. And that has been a pillar of stability in the Taiwan Strait. So that's another reason why things are volatile now. So I put a lot of the blame on Washington on this too. So those are the three corners of the triangle. The final argument is about this timing thing, that we think there's a heightened risk of war prior to the elections in the US and Taiwan in 2020. So first the US presidential election, then the Taiwan presidential election, and these mainland hawks are arguing needs to happen before those elections and it'll be easy. So the US election, Chinese hawks are saying, if Trump loses his re-election bid, we're going to lose an opportunity. Why? Because Trump, they view as a businessman willing to bargain Taiwan away, and as an isolationist who won't intervene if the PLA takes Taiwan by force. This is the kind of motivated reasoning I've been talking about. You see what you want to see. You want to reunify with Taiwan. It's not happening peacefully. You want to argue for forceful reunification, and you say, don't worry about it. We'll be home by Christmas. Trump will roll over. He'll negotiate. And he doesn't really care about democracy in Taiwan anyway. Global times. Once China and the US reach a deal, America will absolutely sacrifice Taiwan on the premise of America first. The United States is not likely to send troops to fight for Taiwan. So this builds on long-standing discourse in mainland China that is built on the core foreign policy ideology that China uses in its relations with the West, which is anti-imperialist nationalism. And that's one that says that, for example, when countries like Denmark stand up on issues like human rights in 2009, it's not because the Danish people give a shit about the human rights of the Chinese people. It's because they're Westerners who want to shit on China again, just like they always have. Excuse my non-diplomatic language, but I got your attention, right? I mean, that's the nationalist interpretation, is Westerners don't really care about human rights. It's just a way to continuously insult and humiliate China, just like the imperialists always have. But Trump makes it worse because of his kind of America First isolationist rhetoric. It gives these delusional thinkers something to grab onto to think that Americans will not react. And I do fundamentally think they're wrong. And even, especially, arguably, Trump's core supporters are the most anti-communist, pro-free China. It just happens that partisanship and ideology are cross currents. So at one level, Republicans do want to support their president out of a partisan loyalty, but at the other hand, core conservative voters are very anti-authoritarian countries. They are the ones who are the most libertarian. They are the ones who are the most jealous of individual liberty, the most suspicious of one-party dictatorships from Moscow to Beijing. So I would argue that Trump's supporters would push him, and he would relish this as an opportunity to rally the people around the flag. This would distract the people from issues of impeachment, for example. People's Daily, in their overseas edition, makes the same kind of argument. The purpose of U.S. bargaining is not to defend Taiwan's democracy. See, it's this old line that Americans, Westerners, don't care about human rights. It's just about 美国霸道, U.S. hegemony. If the price is reasonable, America will sell Taiwan out in the blink of an eye. Trump is a businessman. So this is where I think Shelley Rigger's piece goes into even more detail. But part of why this next year or so is risky is that also have elections coming up in Taiwan. And increasingly you have candidates that are pretty polarized, and you have an independent. And I think a lot of mainland Chinese believe that if the DPP loses, their pretext for forceful reunification will be gone. But that even if you have a relatively pro-China choice, like the Kuomintang, that you're going to have the same situation as you had under Ma Ying-jeou, which is a lot of talk and no change. Maybe we'll go back to giving them economic carrots, and they'll eat our carrots, but they're not going to reunify. Because we now know, after the Sunflower Movement, that the Taiwanese people don't want reunification. So even a Kuomintang victory is not a good thing. How did we come to this interpretation? So we observed how mainland Chinese online responded to the last local elections, where the DPP got thumped. And we were expecting mainland Chinese to be, woohoo! And there were a few people who were like, yes, the DPP got what was coming to them. But there were a lot more nationalists who were like, oh gosh, now they're going to lose and we're not going to be able to have a pretext to invade. And that was flooring. We just really couldn't believe that that was the dominant sentiment from what we were reading online. So the pretext for war would disappear if the DPP didn't win. Yeah, so the local elections, Tsai resigned, but rather than find solace in the DPP's losses, the prospect that the DPP would lose the presidency has increased the urgency of recent Chinese nationalist calls for forceful reunification. This really did surprise us. We were not expecting to see this online. Here's an example. Look at this, cherubic, angel-faced teenage boy. And this is what he's writing. The KMT is not reliable, the DPP sucks. If we want to take our precious island back, we have to use force. You read these quotes and then you click on the little personal, Xi Huan, this is his online moniker, happy-go-lucky, and then you look at his picture, it's like, this is the guy writing this crap? That makes me scared. I mean, it's funny, but it's also worrisome. Young people like this are basically saying, we're ready to use force. We want the PLA to use force. We will support the PLA if it uses force. Whether peaceful or forceful, don't drag this out again and again. Don't let our whole generation fail to see the day when we recover Taiwan. So this is a response to the DPP losing. They're thinking, oh no, our pretext for conflict is going to disappear. We're going to have another 8-year nightmare like we had under Ma Ying-jeou, where they promise us the world and we don't get squat. Okay, almost done here. Wang Zhaixi, former deputy director of the Taiwan Affairs Office, when the DPP came to power, it seemed like the situation got worse, but sometimes a bad thing can be turned to a good thing. The more the DPP promotes Taiwan independence, the more it brings about an opportunity to accelerate reunification. This is the same logic, that essentially the DPP creates an excuse, a pretext for war. Just like the Xi Jinping speech on January 2nd that I started with. It's basically saying, I've been the good guy, Tsai is getting in the way, if we have to use force, it's her fault. And here's what's really disturbing. China may break the enemy's resistance without fighting. He refers to the example of the Beiping Moshi. Just as the Communist Party seized Beijing 70 years ago, exactly this fall, in 1949, without shooting a single bullet, China may do it again to Taiwan. And they lay out all these wishful thinking, motivated reasoning scenarios. We can surround Taiwan, we can impose economic sanctions, we can cut off its oil supply, Taiwan will surrender. And it will achieve an effortless victory. No need to shed blood. How many wars have been started this way? Not just we'll be home by Christmas, but we'll just go boop, and they'll surrender, and there won't be any loss of blood, any loss of life. We won't need to kill any tongbao. I find this kind of motivated reasoning particularly delusional and dangerous. It's exactly the kind of thing that leads to conflict. This is Wang Hongguang. Taiwan Strait is an active volcano about to erupt. There will very likely be military conflict. It's just a question of scale. So I'll leave it there. On that cheery note.
Okay.